Abandoned in the freezing snow, a helpless border collie lay dying, ignored by everyone who passed. No one cared, no one stopped to help. How could this innocent life be left to suffer? What happened next will leave you questioning humanity. The wind howled relentlessly, weaving through the barren trees and carrying with it sharp flurries of snow. The world was silent, wrapped in the suffocating cold of winter. Along an empty road, a sleek black SUV pulled to a stop, its engine rumbling like a growl in the desolate landscape. The driver's door creaked open, and a middle-aged man stepped out, his boots crunching against the icy ground. His sharp coat and polished gloves gleamed against the dull white of the snow, but his face wore an expression of irritation. Walking briskly to the back of the vehicle, the man opened the trunk with a click. Inside, huddled together in a thin blanket, were 4 border collie puppies, each no more than 6 months old. Their black and white fur shimmered even under the dim light, and their eyes, wide and trusting, followed the man's every move. But his focus wasn't on all of them. He reached for one pup in particular, a smaller one with trembling legs, its hindquarters weak and unsteady. This was Buddy, the runt of the litter. Despite its endearing eyes and soft fur, Buddy had been born with a defect in its back legs, rendering it slower and less agile than its siblings. The man grabbed Buddy by the scruff of its neck, lifting it as though it weighed nothing. The puppy whimpered softly, its small tail curling inward as though trying to shield itself from what it could not understand. "Useless," the man muttered, his voice cold and sharp like the wind around them. "You'll never win anything. Just a waste of time and resources." The other puppies watched, their tiny heads tilting in unison as the man carried Buddy to the snowy roadside. They didn't understand why one of their own was being taken away. Their world had always been simple: a warm bed, the smell of their mother, and the occasional visit from this man who fed and cleaned them. But for Buddy, this was the end of that world. The man placed Buddy down on the snow-covered ground with no more care than one might handle a discarded object. The cold seeped into the puppy's paws immediately, and Buddy shivered violently. The little dog tried to steady itself, its hind legs wobbling, but the snow was unforgiving. The man stood there for a moment, his hands on his hips, as if considering whether he should feel regret. But his face hardened. He glanced at the empty road, ensuring no one was around to see him, then turned on his heel and walked back to the SUV. Buddy, confused and desperate, tried to follow. The puppy crawled forward, its front legs clawing at the snow as its back legs dragged uselessly behind. Each movement was painful, but the little dog didn't give up. It let out a soft whine, a final plea for mercy. But the man didn't look back. He climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut and revved the engine. The other puppies in the trunk barked and whimpered, sensing the separation of their sibling, but the man ignored them, turning the car around and driving away without a glance in the rearview mirror. The sound of tires crunching on snow grew softer and softer until only silence remained. Buddy lay where it had fallen, its small body trembling uncontrollably. The cold bit deeply, every gust of wind piercing like a knife. Snowflakes began to gather on its fur, forming a white frost that made the black patches of its coat stand out even more starkly. The puppy's mind drifted back to the warmth of its litter. It remembered the gentle nuzzles of its mother, her fur thick and soft, and the playful nudges from its siblings. Even though Buddy had always been the weakest, the smallest, it had never felt unloved. Until now. Buddy's breaths grew shallower as the cold tightened its grip. Its small chest rose and fell unevenly, and its eyes, once bright with curiosity, began to glaze over. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, creating a pristine, unbroken blanket over the world, a world that seemed to have no place for a tiny, broken puppy. And yet, even as its body succumbed to the freezing night, Buddy's spirit clung to the faintest flicker of hope. Somewhere deep within, a will to survive burned, defying the cruel fate that had been thrust upon it. The road stretched out before Buddy, empty and silent. But this was not the end of its story, for even as the snow threatened to bury it completely, fate was already at work, sending someone who would change everything. The afternoon sun hung low, casting faint golden hues over the snow-covered road. The icy wind howled through the barren landscape, weaving through the trees and biting at anything in its path. Mark Walker gripped the steering wheel of his old, reliable Ford F-150, the truck rumbling softly as it rolled along the desolate highway. It was a typical vehicle for someone like Mark, practical, sturdy, and unassuming, just like its owner. Mark had owned the truck for years, a remnant of a time when life was full of purpose. Back then, it had carried his family to countless outings, trips to the park with his wife, Laura, and their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, or excursions to the lake, where laughter echoed through the air. Now the truck felt empty, like his life. It had been 2 years since the accident. Losing Laura and Emily had left Mark adrift, his days a monotonous cycle of work at the factory and long, lonely evenings in a house that felt more like a museum of memories. The echoes of laughter had long been replaced by the oppressive silence that settled over the modest home. As he drove, Mark's thoughts wandered, pulled back to the familiar ache of loss. But something ahead on the road broke through his haze, a small, dark shape lying on the snow-covered shoulder. At first, Mark thought it was just trash blown there by the wind. He might have kept driving, but something about the shape nagged at him, tugging at the edges of his mind. Slowing the truck, Mark pulled over, his tires crunching against the icy ground. He grabbed his worn leather gloves from the dashboard and stepped out, the cold wind hitting him like a slap. Pulling his coat tighter around himself, he walked toward the object, his boots sinking into the snow with each step. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't trash. It was a puppy. The small border collie lay almost motionless, its black and white fur matted with dirt and partially covered by frost. Its tiny body trembled faintly, and its shallow breaths sent weak puffs of steam into the frigid air. Mark knelt down, his chest tightening as he reached out a gloved hand. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured, his voice soft yet filled with concern. His fingers brushed against the puppy's side, feeling the faint rise and fall of its chest. It was alive, but only just. Mark noticed faint red stains near the pup's mouth and paws, signs of a desperate struggle to survive in the merciless cold. Its hind legs twitched weakly, as if trying to move but failing. Without hesitation, Mark gently scooped the puppy into his arms. Its body was alarmingly cold, like holding a handful of snow. He tucked it close to his chest, wrapping his coat around the fragile creature to shield it from the biting wind. "You're okay now," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. "I've got you." Back in the warmth of the truck, Mark cranked up the heater, letting the warm air flow over the trembling pup. He held it carefully in his lap, one hand stroking its matted fur, while the other steadied the steering wheel. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" he said, his voice soft. The puppy gave a faint whimper, its head resting limply against Mark's arm. He glanced down at it, his chest tightening at the thought of how close it had come to freezing to death. By the time Mark pulled into his driveway, the sky had grown dark, and snow was falling again in soft, lazy flakes. He carried the puppy inside, moving quickly to light the fireplace. The room filled with the crackling warmth of flames, chasing away the icy chill that had gripped the little house. Mark laid the puppy on a soft towel near the hearth and began cleaning its fur with a warm, damp cloth. Dirt and ice melted away under his careful touch, revealing patches of soft black and white fur. He inspected the puppy for injuries, noticing the deformity in its hind legs. "You've had a rough start, haven't you?" Mark said, his voice tinged with both sadness and tenderness. The puppy gave no response, only the faintest flicker of its ears acknowledging his words. Mark wrapped it in an old blanket and sat beside it, watching as its breathing gradually steadied under the warmth of the fire. The next morning, Mark called the local animal control center to report the puppy. The officer on the line asked for details, where he had found it, its condition, and whether he could care for it temporarily while they logged the case. Mark agreed, knowing he couldn't send the pup to a shelter in its fragile state. Over the following days, Mark devoted himself to the puppy's care. He fed it small, warm meals, ensuring it regained its strength bit by bit. Slowly, the once lifeless pup began to show signs of recovery. Its shivering stopped, its eyes brightened, and it began to follow Mark around the house with a quiet curiosity. At night, when the silence in the house used to feel unbearable, Mark found himself talking to the little dog. He told it about his day, about the memories of his family, and about the empty space they had left behind. The puppy never answered, of course, but its presence filled the void in a way Mark hadn't thought possible. Mark didn't know what the future held for the pup, whether someone might come forward to claim it or if it would stay. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose. Maybe, just maybe, saving this little dog had saved something in him too. Buddy's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Under Mark's attentive care, the once frail and trembling pup began to thrive. Though his hind legs remained weak and unsteady, Buddy's energy seemed boundless. His curious eyes darted from one corner of the house to the other, and his tail wagged with such enthusiasm that it seemed to make up for his physical limitations. Mark often found himself smiling as Buddy's playful antics brought life back into his quiet home. It wasn't just the puppy's energy, it was his intelligence. Buddy seemed to understand Mark's tone, his gestures, and even his silences. One chilly morning, Mark decided to spend some time in the backyard. The frost-covered grass sparkled under the pale winter sun, and Buddy followed closely at his heels, his small paws crunching softly on the frozen ground. Mark had found an old orange plastic ball in the garage and brought it outside, thinking it might give Buddy something to play with. "Let's see if you're up for a little fun," Mark said with a grin, tossing the ball gently across the yard. To his surprise, Buddy didn't just chase the ball, he leapt into the air, catching it with precision before it even hit the ground. Mark froze in place, his mouth slightly open as he watched the puppy land on all fours, wobbling only slightly before trotting back toward him with the ball clutched proudly in his mouth. "Well, I'll be," Mark muttered, kneeling to take the ball from Buddy's jaws. "Where did you learn to do that?" Mark tossed the ball again, this time farther, and once again Buddy took off like a rocket. Despite his uneven gait, the pup moved with startling agility, jumping gracefully and snagging the ball mid-air. "Looks like you got a talent there, Buddy," Mark said, laughing as Buddy brought the ball back, wagging his tail furiously. Later that afternoon, Mark's neighbor, Rose Carter, stopped by. Rose, a retired schoolteacher with a lifelong love of animals, had been curious about the new addition to Mark's life. As she stood by the fence watching Buddy play, her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Mark," she called out, her voice warm and cheerful. "Where did you find that little superstar?" Mark chuckled, tossing the ball for Buddy once more. "Found him by the side of the road. Poor guy was in rough shape, but he's bounced back pretty well." Rose watched as Buddy once again leaped into the air, catching the ball effortlessly. "That's not just pretty well, Mark. That's talent." "Talent?" Mark replied, glancing at her with a raised brow. "He's got a bad leg, Rose. I don't think he's cut out for much more than chasing a ball in the yard." Rose shook her head. "Don't sell him short. I've seen dogs with worse conditions accomplish incredible things. With the right training, he could do really well in competitions." Mark laughed softly, brushing off the idea. "Competitions? Come on, Rose, look at him. He's not exactly built for the spotlight." But Rose wouldn't back down. "Mark, that dog has heart. He's got determination, and trust me, that counts for more than perfect legs. You should at least consider it." Mark looked back at Buddy, who was now bouncing excitedly at his feet, the ball clutched tightly in his jaws. There was something in the dog's eyes, an eagerness, a spark of intelligence, that made Mark pause. "Maybe," he said quietly, more to himself than to Rose. maybe he could. That evening, as Buddy lay curled up by the fire, Mark sat nearby, tossing the ball gently from one hand to the other. Rose's words lingered in his mind. He had never thought of Buddy as anything more than a rescued dog, a companion to fill the silence of his home. But what if Rose was right? What if Buddy could do more? Mark glanced at the sleeping pup, his tail twitching slightly in a dream. The thought of pushing Buddy to achieve something greater filled Mark with a sense of cautious hope. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose, a reason to look beyond the grief that had weighed him down. Little did Mark know, this was just the beginning of an incredible journey for both him and Buddy. It was a chilly morning when Mark found himself standing in the registration line for the local dog competition. The air was crisp, and his breath formed small clouds as he glanced nervously at the other participants. Buddy sat at his feet, his tail wagging excitedly as he watched the other dogs, some of them sleek, polished, and clearly well-trained. Mark had never imagined himself in a place like this. When Rose had first suggested the idea, he had laughed it off, but her persistence had worn him down. "It's not about winning," she had said. "It's about showing the world what Buddy is capable of." Now here they were, surrounded by competitors who looked like they had been preparing for years. Mark felt out of place, but Buddy seemed oblivious to the tension. The little dog's enthusiasm was infectious, and Mark found himself smiling despite his nerves. The competition began with simple obedience exercises. Buddy's turn came quickly, and Mark led him to the starting line. As the judge gave the signal, Buddy performed each command with surprising precision. Despite his limp, he sat, stayed, and followed Mark's instructions with an eagerness that drew smiles from the crowd. Next came the agility course. Mark hesitated as he looked at the series of jumps, tunnels, and weaving poles. He doubted Buddy's ability to navigate the course, especially with his weak hind legs. But when the whistle blew, Buddy took off with determination. The crowd watched in awe as the small border collie leaped over obstacles, crawled through tunnels, and weaved between poles with a mix of speed and cleverness. Though his movements weren't as smooth as the other dogs, Buddy compensated with sheer intelligence, finding ways to adapt to the course. He stumbled once or twice, but he got back up, tail wagging, and continued without hesitation. By the time Buddy crossed the finish line, the audience erupted into applause. Mark crouched down, wrapping his arms around the panting dog. "You did it, Buddy. You really did it," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. When the awards ceremony began, Mark didn't expect much. The other dogs had performed flawlessly, and he knew Buddy's performance wasn't perfect. But as the announcer stepped forward, a hush fell over the crowd. "For demonstrating extraordinary spirit, resilience, and intelligence, the Spirit Award goes to Buddy Walker." Mark blinked in surprise as the crowd erupted into cheers. He looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail furiously, as if he understood the significance of the moment. Carrying Buddy in his arms, Mark stepped onto the small podium to receive the ribbon. The announcer smiled warmly as he handed it to him. "Your dog has something special, Mr. Walker. He's an inspiration." As the event wound down, Mark was approached by other participants and spectators, many of whom were moved by Buddy's story. Word spread quickly about the little dog, who had overcome the odds to compete. Someone snapped a photo of Mark holding Buddy with the ribbon around his neck, and by the next day, the story was circulating on social media. "Abandoned puppy finds hope and brings inspiration to all," read one headline. Mark was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him, and strangers reached out to share how Buddy's journey had touched them. For Mark, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about seeing Buddy thrive and knowing that he had helped the little dog find his place in the world. That night, as Buddy curled up by the fireplace, his ribbon resting on the mantel, Mark sat nearby, reflecting on the day. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of pride and purpose. Buddy wasn't just a rescued dog. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the smallest and most broken among us can achieve extraordinary things. And Mark realized that Buddy wasn't the only one who had found a second chance. Together, they had begun a journey of healing, proving that hope could bloom in the most unexpected places. The story of Buddy's remarkable spirit and determination had spread like wildfire after the local competition. Photos and videos of the small border collie leaping through obstacles and receiving his ribbon made their way onto social media. People were inspired by his journey, from a freezing roadside rescue to a celebrated competitor. But not everyone viewed the story with admiration. Miles away in his spacious home, surrounded by manicured fields, Frank Mitchell scrolled through his phone. His sharp features twisted into a scowl as he watched a video of Buddy catching a ball mid-air during the competition. The caption read, "From abandoned to inspiring Buddy Walker, the resilient border collie." Frank set his phone down, his jaw tightening. He was no stranger to the world of dog competitions. As a well-known breeder and trainer, his dogs often dominated the circuit. But he had no patience for imperfection. Any dog that didn't meet his exacting standards was quickly dismissed. Buddy had been no exception. "That mutt," he muttered to himself. "I didn't think it would amount to anything." But seeing Buddy now, receiving praise and attention that could have been his, stirred something in Frank. The dog might have been flawed, but it was clear it had potential he had overlooked. A few days later, Mark heard the crunch of tires on his driveway. He looked out the window to see a gleaming black SUV pulling up, its polished exterior reflecting the mid-morning sunlight. His brow furrowed as he stepped onto the porch, Buddy trailing behind him with his tail wagging obliviously. The driver's door opened, and a man in an expensive coat stepped out. His sharp, calculating eyes immediately scanned Mark and then dropped to Buddy. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. Mark crossed his arms. "Can I help you?" The man extended a hand, though Mark didn't take it. "Frank Mitchell, I believe you have something of mine." Mark frowned. "I don't think so." Frank's lips curled into a thin smile. "That dog," he said, gesturing to Buddy, who had stepped closer to Mark. "Buddy, he's mine." Mark felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Yours? You mean the dog I found freezing to death on the side of the road? The one you abandoned?" Frank's expression didn't waver. "I didn't abandon him. There must have been a misunderstanding. He wandered off, that's all." Mark took a step forward, his voice firm. "Don't insult me. I know what I found, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. You left him to die because he didn't meet your standards, didn't you?" Frank's smile faltered, replaced by a slight sneer. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Buddy is my property, and I'm here to reclaim him. Now, hand him over." Mark shook his head, his fists clenching. "Buddy isn't yours. You gave up that right the moment you left him in the snow. He's my dog now, and I'm not giving him up." Frank's eyes narrowed and his voice turned cold. "You don't get to make that decision. I have documentation proving ownership. If you don't cooperate, I'll take this to court." The conversation ended in a tense standoff. Frank returned to his SUV, but not before issuing a final warning. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Mark watched the car disappear down the road, his heart pounding. He looked down at Buddy, who was sitting at his feet, oblivious to the confrontation. "Don't worry, Buddy," Mark said softly, stroking the dog's head. "No one's taking you away. Not now, not ever." That evening, Mark sat by the fireplace, his mind racing. He thought about Frank's cold, calculating demeanor and his willingness to treat Buddy as nothing more than a possession. It was clear Frank didn't care about the dog, only the attention and potential fame Buddy could bring. Mark knew he had to fight, not just for Buddy, but for the bond they had built, for the love and trust they had found in each other. Frank Mitchell might have been Buddy's owner once, but Mark was his family now, and family wasn't something you gave up without a fight. The moment Frank left Mark's property, Mark knew the situation was far from over. His instincts were proven right when, just 2 days later, an official notice arrived. Frank Mitchell was filing a lawsuit to reclaim Buddy, claiming ownership of the dog and accusing Mark of keeping it illegally. Mark's first reaction was frustration. Frank's audacity to not only abandon Buddy, But also try to take him back after the dog had found a loving home was infuriating. But as Mark read through the notice, his anger gave way to determination. He wouldn't let Buddy go without a fight. Mark reached out to James Miller, a local attorney known for his dedication to justice. When Mark explained the situation, James listened intently, his brow furrowing as the story unfolded. "Let me get this straight," James said, leaning forward. "This man left Buddy in the snow, you rescued him, and now that the dog has found recognition, he wants him back." "That's exactly it," Mark replied. "Buddy was half dead when I found him. He's mine now, not his." James nodded. "We have a strong case here. If Frank abandoned Buddy, he legally forfeited his ownership. Let's gather evidence to prove it." Over the next few days, James and Mark worked tirelessly to build their case. The evidence included the animal control report. Mark had reported finding Buddy to the local centre shortly after rescuing him, fulfilling his legal responsibility to attempt to locate the original owner. The report detailed Buddy's poor condition when found and noted that no one had come forward to claim him during the waiting period. Witness testimony. Rose Carter, Mark's neighbour, agreed to testify. She described Buddy's frail state when Mark first brought him home and emphasized the care and love Mark had provided. Rose also shared her observations about Buddy's progress under Mark's care. Photographic evidence. Mark had taken photos of Buddy on the night he found him. The images showed the puppy nearly buried in snow, his fur matted, his eyes half closed, and his frail body trembling. These photos, paired with Mark's detailed account, painted a stark picture of neglect. James assured Mark, "The court will see that Buddy was abandoned. Frank can't just waltz in and claim ownership after the fact." The court date arrived quickly, and Mark entered the small courtroom with Buddy by his side. Frank sat on the opposite side, his lawyer at his shoulder, and a confident smirk on his face. Buddy, unaware of the tension, wagged his tail happily, leaning against Mark's leg for reassurance. The proceedings began with Frank's attorney arguing that Buddy had never been abandoned, but had simply wandered off during training. Frank claimed he had been searching for the dog and only discovered its location after hearing about Buddy's public appearance. James, calm and collected, dismantled Frank's argument piece by piece. "Your Honour," James began, stepping forward, "this is not a case of a lost dog. It is a case of abandonment. My client, Mark Walker, found Buddy in a condition no loved or cared for pet should ever be in, malnourished, injured, and left to freeze in the snow. The evidence speaks for itself." James presented the animal control report, emphasizing that no one had come forward during the mandatory waiting period to claim Buddy. He showed the photos of Buddy on the night he was found, his frail body barely clinging to life. Finally, Rose took the stand. She described how Mark had saved Buddy and nurtured him back to health, transforming a near-death pup into the thriving, happy dog that now sat wagging his tail in the courtroom. When it was Frank's turn to speak, his defense began to crumble. Under questioning, he struggled to explain why Buddy had been found miles away from his property in such a dire state. His vague responses and shifting storylines only made him appear evasive and untrustworthy. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. This court finds sufficient evidence that Mr. Frank Mitchell abandoned the dog known as Buddy, forfeiting his ownership rights. The court also finds that Mr. Mark Walker has provided exceptional care and a loving home for the animal. Therefore, custody of Buddy is awarded to Mr. Walker. The gavel struck, and Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He glanced down at Buddy, who looked up at him with bright eyes, as if understanding that he was safe. Frank, on the other hand, stormed out of the courtroom, his expression twisted in frustration. That evening, back at home, Mark placed Buddy's ribbon from the competition on the mantel. "You're home, Buddy," he said softly, scratching the dog's ears, "and no one's ever going to take you away." Buddy wagged his tail, curling up at Mark's feet by the fire, where the two of them settled into a quiet evening. For the first time in years, Mark felt at peace, knowing that the bond he shared with Buddy was now unbreakable. Buddy's journey didn't end in the courtroom. It was only the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope and inspiration. With Mark by his side, Buddy began to participate in more competitions, each one showcasing his intelligence, agility, and indomitable spirit. Despite his physical limitations, Buddy excelled in ways no one could have imagined. His ability to adapt and persevere captured the attention of judges and spectators alike. At every event, the little border collie received standing ovations, his story touching hearts far beyond the boundaries of the competition ring. Over time, Buddy became more than a competitor. He became a symbol of resilience. News outlets featured his story, and Mark often found himself approached by strangers who shared how Buddy had inspired them to overcome their own challenges. Children with disabilities looked up to Buddy as a hero, while adults saw in him the courage to keep going despite life's setbacks. Mark, who once lived in the shadows of grief, found his purpose in sharing Buddy's journey. The bond between man and dog became a beacon of hope, proving that love and kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. Buddy's fame grew, but his happiest moments remained the simplest ones, playing fetch in the backyard, resting by the fireplace, or curling up next to Mark on quiet evenings. Buddy's story reminds us that even the most broken and abandoned can rise to greatness with a little love and compassion. His journey from a snowy roadside to a celebrated star is a testament to resilience, kindness, and the power of second chances. In our lives, we often encounter challenges or see others facing their own struggles. Buddy shows us that no obstacle is too great when we are surrounded by care and belief. Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you for the lessons you show us through your creation. May we always be inspired to show compassion, give second chances, and find hope in unexpected places. Bless everyone who fights for the weak and forgotten, and may we all carry your love in our hearts. Amen. Has Buddy's story touched your heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your own stories of kindness, resilience, or the animals that have changed your life. And if you know someone who could use a little inspiration today, share this story with them. Together, we can spread hope, love, and the belief that every life is worth fighting for. Let's keep the spirit of Buddy alive by sharing these powerful lessons with the world.